Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative, where we are talking about things relating to children's right to read. Today, I am speaking with the wonderful Dr. Stephanie Stollar from the Reading Science Academy, and we are focusing on in-service training for teachers, whether that be professional development or potentially things at the master's, the post bachelor's level. And these are related to recommendations 54 through 58 in the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read report. Thank you for joining me again, Dr. Stoller. Can you just give everybody a little brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me to this conversation about this important topic and report. So I am a part-time assistant professor in the online reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University. And I'm also the founder of the Reading Science Academy, which you mentioned. It is a subscription membership opportunity for folks to learn about the science of reading and to get support to implement it. We are a community of people who are learning at all different stages of learning. It's not an online course, but it's a really nice follow-up to doing some type of professional development related to reading science, because people get support to apply what they've learned in their classroom, in their school, in their university. We do have a few university professors as members, which is wonderful. So I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. This topic of improving reading outcomes for students is what has driven me across my 30 plus years in education. And I feel like this is a really exciting time with activities like this report that has come out recently to support all of us educators to be getting it right for kids, because we know too much to be getting these low outcomes in reading. It's frustrating, but also I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction finally.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it definitely gives us a lot of hope. And it's just making sure that we have the right support for the teachers who really in their training program didn't get the information that they needed to teach children how to read. And that's really a disservice to the teachers, especially when some of these concepts relating to best practices in reading instruction and understanding how we read have been around for so long now.
Yeah. That's what I hear. I work primarily with students at the graduate level. So teachers sometimes who've been teaching for a couple of decades, and they get into our coursework, and what I hear over and over again is, why am I just learning about this for the first time? Why did I not know? I've taught for X number of years, and I knew something wasn't quite right with my teaching, but I didn't know what to do instead. And they feel frustrated. They feel like they've been cheated. They feel guilty because they haven't been effective with the students that they've had in the past. And it doesn't need to be that way. So, that's why I'm focusing a lot of my work in higher education, trying to support us to get this right the first time around with instruction. But even if we would wave a magic wand and all of that would be fixed up in pre-service training, we still have all of these teachers who are currently working with students, administrators who are currently working in schools, all the related service folks, speech pathologists and school psychologists, all of those people who are currently working, who need to sort of retool their understanding of how reading develops and how best to support students to become readers. So I think that's the focus of our conversation today, is that section of the report that really highlights what we can be doing on the job, so to speak, to get people up to speed.
Well, and there's so many teachers that teach for 30, 40 years. So if every pre-service training program changed today, there would be still that 30 to 40 year gap where teachers didn't have it in their pre-service training that we need to work on. And the fact that best practices are constantly evolving.
True. That's an important thing to understand about the science of reading, about the science itself, that it's not this static set of practices or a static set of knowledge that we can just sort of go to the shelf and pull it off and say, okay, I've read this, now I know the science of reading. It is constantly evolving. It's this ongoing search for truth, for what works best with students, and it evolves constantly over time. That's the point of science, is to engage in inquiry, to challenge the current practices, to challenge the current way of thinking, and to test out what works best, what works better than other things, so that we can keep on refining our understandings. And so we have to have the expectation that it's going to change. And so there we go back to that idea of being a lifelong learner and this importance of in-service professional learning, that once you get your degree, you're not finished by any stretch.
No, I think, the number of books and articles that I read a year to keep up on this stuff is probably close to equivalent to the stuff that I was reading during my PhD.
Yeah. Fortunately, that's something that I enjoy doing.
Yeah.
I like to read. I like to read for pleasure too, as my book club that I'm meeting with tonight will be happy to hear me say. But I like to read for professional reasons. There's a lot to learn, and the people I interact with, like these conversations with folks in the Reading Science Academy, keep me asking questions, keep me searching for information. And so I'm trying to model that, I guess, for others, that sort of reading and keeping up with my own understanding of things. As soon as I think I have a good handle on some of these topics, here comes a new piece of research to throw a wrench into things and either help clarify my understanding or make me understand that I don't know as much as I thought I might have.
Well, I find even reading some of the quote unquote classics, a second or third time, the second or third time that you read them, like I've been going through Beginning to Read by Adams again. And it's like, oh, I don't think I picked that up the first time. And, just reading it again with the new knowledge that you have that you didn't have the first time that you read it.
That's right.
Makes a difference. I remember the first time that I read Seidenberg's Language at the Speed of Sight. I'm like, whoa.
Yes.
And Reading in the Brain, like it was very heavy, but then going back and reading it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. Well, many of those, like the books that you're mentioning, not only are worth reading multiple times, but are so dense that I think it takes reading multiple times, at least for me. Like I have to read carefully. I have to read slowly, reread some paragraphs multiple times as I'm going through, and take notes as I'm reading those, because there's so much rich information.
Yeah, definitely. And then like, I know, like I'll highlight or underline as I read, I'm like, why did I do that? And then I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Go back and find your Post-it notes. Like, what was it about that section that caught my interest? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really good. All right. So let's move to what we can do for, the current teachers that are in the classroom, in the trenches, because it's not like they're stopping and taking a gap year for learning. I mean, some might be, but we need to make it so it's accessible and covering the topics that they need and going to their level, and not assuming that they can jump to some of the more advanced programs that talk about the concepts, and you don't want them to feel like they're drowning.
Right. And I think it's important to link that new learning to what educators are experiencing in their job. So I liked the phrase in the report that talked about job embedded learning. I think that's really important. And for me, an element of that is that it's sustained over time. So speaking to administrators and coaches and people who are going to be planning these professional learning opportunities, this is not a one and done. This is not, the week before school starts, we have an in-service day and check the box, we've done our science of reading training. This is something that's going to need to be sustained over time, that's going to need an investment of time and money. And it's going to need to be connected to what people are doing with real children in schools, because sometimes there's a risk that, we talk about reading science, that it's this airy-fairy, esoteric academic endeavor that's, just something we're learning about in university. But we really need to get to the place where it's applied to children in schools, and it helps teachers to be more effective with children with their reading skills. So even when I look at some of the recommendations that are in the report that refer to the need for learning around theories and about the foundations of reading and about how reading develops. So those can seem like they're, theoretical, right? Like that's what sometimes in service training, teachers will react to, enough with the theory, quit talking about the theory, get to the practical, what should I do in my classroom? But in this case, I think it's important to connect what you do in your classroom to the theories. So I'm thinking about one theory in particular, which to say it's a theory is really even not doing it justice, but the simple view of reading, this idea that has been documented and confirmed in hundreds of studies over time, that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition, automatic and efficient word recognition, and language comprehension. And the fact that those two broad capabilities or capacities have to be in place for students to understand what they're reading. We can unpack that in a lot of detail, but just to be able to know that reading comprehension results from having skills in the area of language comprehension and the area of word recognition, that can frame what you're doing very, very practically in schools, right? So a lot of the recommendations for in-service training are around word recognition and getting those foundational decoding skills in place. Also about the connection between word recognition and reading comprehension. And the reason for those recommendations for changing what we do in the classroom is because of the simple view of reading, right? It's not coming out of thin air. It's not something somebody just dreamt up. Well, they did dream it up one day, but it's been confirmed by study after study after study. You will not understand what you're reading if you are missing language comprehension and or word recognition. So it's the combination of both of those capacities that comes together to produce reading comprehension. So you think about folks who are teaching in primary grade classrooms, knowing that theory about how reading comprehension is the result of language comprehension and word recognition helps those primary grade teachers keep both of those strands operating in their classroom. So this is what keeps us from being, phonics centric, as we're sometimes accused of being, that as you're building that letter sound relationship and students' ability to recognize words instantly, you also must be building their spoken vocabulary, their listening comprehension skills, their ability to understand complex text that's read to them, with elements like syntax. So both of those capacities need to be developed simultaneously. It's not that we can teach word recognition and then in fourth grade switch over to teaching language comprehension. The simple view tells us they both have to be taught. So that's one way that I'm thinking about making the recommendation around knowledge of the theories of how reading develops practical and bringing it into what's happening in the classroom.
Well, and I think it's so important to understand the simple view of reading, especially when we're talking about kids who struggle with reading, as far as accommodations go, and also interventions, because there are a lot of different interventions out there. And it's very hard for a student to be placed in an information or an intervention and be given the promise that it's going to work and then have it not work when really we're intervening the wrong skill.
Yeah.
And making sure that, that the teachers understand, that everybody understands what actually needs to be worked on for that student.
That's right.
And how to accomplish it. And then, finding out how you can make use of those audiobooks for a student that has strong listening comprehension, but poor word recognition, so they can access the grade appropriate texts, but still have the ability to read it because they're listening to it.
That's right.
And they can work on their comprehension strategies while listening to it, and then work on the word recognition strategies at a different part. You can't just forget the word recognition because you've supplemented with an audiobook.
That's right. Both of those capacities have to be built up. So for those older students who are struggling with reading comprehension, the simple view gives us those two domains to explore, right? Like we can investigate, because reading comprehension problems will be the result of either not having sufficient language comprehension or not having sufficient word recognition skills, or both in some cases. And so it gives us a place to go when we're faced in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th grade with a student who's not understanding grade level text. We can investigate, we can assess the student's skills in those two broad domains. And then it gives us, as you're saying, a place to target our efforts. So we're not doing what I often see in those intermediate grades and above, which is focusing on reading comprehension. We think because the student has a reading comprehension problem, that's what we're seeing in front of us, that means we should teach or intervene on reading comprehension, when really we have to dig what's underneath the reading comprehension problem, what's causing the reading comprehension problem. And it will be either something related to language comprehension or word recognition, or both. So yeah, as we're doing something like keeping the connection to the grade level content and texts going, as you're saying, with listening to those materials, we also need to be intervening and catching up those deficit word recognition skills. So those are important, again, practical ways to put into practice that foundational theory about what's going on with reading, how reading develops.
And I think it's very helpful to actually put numbers into the equation.
Yeah.
To see how much of an impact it can have, even if, so when you put numerical values into the simple reading, EV reading, it's from 0 to 1, right? So it's a decimal number.
Yeah.
Any decimal number times any other number is going to make it smaller.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that is like, oh yeah, well, they're a 0.7 in language comprehension and a 0.5 in word recognition. Well, that brings them down to 0.35.
Yeah. It's not a full 1 of reading comprehension. Yeah.
Yeah. It really makes that clarity, and talking people through that is really a helpful process.
Yeah. I had a question related to that that came up earlier today, actually, where a teacher was claiming that their student was an accurate reader, but not a fluent reader, and didn't have automatic word recognition. Could get it, if given time, she could get each of the words in the grade level text. And the teacher was claiming it wasn't impacting that student's reading comprehension. And I thought of the simple view. I thought, yeah, she doesn't have a full 1.0, in that category of word recognition. At some point, that's going to impact her reading comprehension. We have to have absolute, automatic, and fluent word recognition to support that reading comprehension.
Well, especially like one thing that I think has been left out of this is the importance of understanding what working memory is.
Yes.
And how that impacts everything.
Yes.
Working on the automaticity, and it will impact the reading comprehension. If a student has poor working memory, their ability to remember what they've read is impacted.
That's right.
And if we're still at the decoding stage, even though they may be accurate, That's very taxing on the working memory.
Yes.
So it
And
impacts comprehension.
The sort of opposite of that, or the reverse of that, is also true. The more we can increase their skills in these component areas, the less the working memory will be taxed, right? That's what we want to get to, where they have that automaticity and fluency with these foundational skills.
Exactly.
And that's just making me think about the mention in the report of the foundational skills. And I'm wondering if you think people even know what those are, if that's something we should unpack.
I think it's definitely worth going into, because they may be able to list them off, but really understanding what they mean and what teachers need to understand about them and be able to do in their class is something that we need to address, because especially when we're looking at, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, those are so important, and understanding how you can use those 5 components to help.
Yeah, so even before sort of going into those 5 components, I would think about one of the things that the simple view is indicating, and that is that reading is a language-based skill, right? So I think that's one of the most important elements of the science of reading for educators to understand, because in their training, they might have been told that reading is more of a visual activity, or reading problems are caused by problems with vision, like letter reversals or things like that are not accurate. We know more now, and we know that reading is not something that it's not the same as language. Language is sort of hardwired into our brains. We're born for spoken language. If we're in an environment of English speakers, we're going to learn to speak English without a lot of instruction or any instruction. But reading doesn't work in the same way. So when we start thinking about what these 5 components are that research has converged around as essential for students to become readers, we have to sort of couch that in this understanding that reading is not a naturally occurring event, that it has to be directly taught for the majority of students. And for some students, it's quite difficult for them to acquire. So I think having that frame around the 5 skills can be helpful. So Phonema, go ahead.
Sorry, the other thing that I think is really important to just spell, and it's still very prevalent, is that there's multiple ways to read a word.
Good point.
And while, you can look at syllables like synthetic versus analytic phonics, it's still essential that we focus on the letters and don't distract from the written word by using some of those MSV strategies.
Right. Yeah, that's when we get into the what to do and what not to do, that's a really important distinction. And it goes against what some people were trained in, right? So this is where some of that unlearning for people who are in service is going to need to take place. And for people who are planning these professional learning experiences, expect to spend some time here, right? That what we're doing when we're teaching reading and writing is giving students access to that code, that the written English is representation of our speech at the level of the individual sound. So English is, not every language operates this way, but the written English language does. So what's represented by individual letters, by combinations of letters, are the sounds of our speech, and not at the level of the word or the syllable, but at the level of the phoneme, which might be new terminology for some people, this smallest unit of spoken sound that alters the meaning. So the word cat has 3 phonemes, and the word shop has 3 phonemes, right? So it's not about the letters, it's about the sounds. And the word box has 4 phonemes, right? So giving young students the awareness of the sound structure of our language, and what's really important is that they get to the point of not just identifying words, in this garbled smudge of speech, but they can become aware of the individual sounds in speech, so that they will be able to read and spell. So the reason to know phonemic awareness, the reason for your ear to get in tune with those small units of spoken language is so you can map the sound to the symbol. So either an individual letter or a string of letters. And that's really the important part. That's the phonics and decoding piece. The spelling piece is working both sides of that, knowing that I want to write the word cat and being able to represent it with letters, and looking at the letters and knowing that the word is cat. So working it in both directions. And once students can lift that word off of the page and into their oral language, they have to know the meaning of it, right? And they also need to be able to know the meaning of the word in the context of the sentence. So I might be able to read R-E-A-D, but is it read or read? So once we've decoded the word, we need to be able to use our knowledge of the word meanings in multiple contexts to figure out what it means in this particular sentence. We need knowledge of syntax and word order to know what does the word mean in this paragraph or in this text. And we need to have some knowledge of the content of what we're reading so we can draw inferences. We can use our working memory to integrate what we're reading into what we already know. So 5 components: phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, oral language and vocabulary, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. Those are the 5 areas that should be the primary focus of our reading instruction. So that gives people some rich reading and learning and studying to do, to go deep into what those 5 skill areas are, why each of them are important, how they relate to each other, because they're not just separate standalone skills, but most of them are reciprocal with each other. And what the research says about how best to teach those. And then for people who are working with students with disabilities, especially, how to intervene when those skills are not coming easily to students. So that's a lifetime of learning, but not to overwhelm people. Get started with just unpacking and learning about what those skill areas are. It's a really good place to start.
Well, and I think it's really important when you look at things like phonics instruction. So many people think of just, the alphabet A to Z. Well, the English language has 20 consonant sounds and 24 vowel sounds, but 26 letters. So there's a disconnect there. And understanding things like a digraph, which is 2 letters representing 1 phoneme. And there are several consonant ones that, when you're reading the word the, you're not going
right.
So teaching the kids that in some instances, there are 2 letters that represent 1 song or sound. And then thinking about it's not sing, g, it's sing,
Right.
And these are things that, again, weren't around for most teachers when they were learning how to read. We weren't teaching reading this way. And it's not something that you're likely going to get by yourself unless you have that instruction in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as people are thinking about either gaining this knowledge themselves or preparing others, providing in-service professional development for their staff, for example, the more that you know as an adult about how our English writing system works, how our English language works, how the system of language and the layers of language work, the more equipped you are going to be to do a couple of things with your students. First of all, you're going to be more equipped to recognize problems when they happen really early on. And there's a lot in the report that's directed towards that sort of early screening and early identification. And you're also going to do a better job teaching these skills in a way that is easier for kids to learn, because you'll be able to sequence these things in a reasonable order from simple to complex, from easier to harder, so that your students are more likely to acquire these skills. So there's a lot of value for educators to increase their level of knowledge of the English language, spoken and written, so that they can watch out for problems, so they can prevent problems with their students, so they can present the instruction in a way that is going to be maximally effective.
Definitely. Now, do you happen to have a visual right by of those 5 components? I could probably pull out a book that has them.
I do. As a matter of fact,
Okay.
we didn't plan this ahead of time, but what do you know? I'm working on a presentation for a school district next week, and I just happen to have the PowerPoint slides handy here. And so let me get to the one here. I'm going to pull this one up. So am I able to share?
You should be.
Okay, so let's see if this works. Okay, so this is just one that I use that lists the 5 components. So phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, that letter sound relationship, reading fluency, reading comprehension. And I sort of do them in this stair step visual with vocabulary along the side, because
vocabulary is so embedded. And I think when I talk about, the simple view of reading, or the Scarborough's reading rope, and how important vocabulary actually plays in all of these instances.
Right. That's right. So one that I think is most surprising, has been most surprising to me, would be something like the value of writing down the words when you're trying to learn the new meanings of words, right? So the research that suggests that when you write down the sequence of letters in the word, as you're learning a new vocabulary word, you're more likely to remember the meaning of that word in the future. So just, sort of that mapping of that word into your brain idea. So these are not, let's see what happens when I click. No, that's not what I want. These are not isolated standalone. We talk about them separately a lot, but as you're saying, they're very, very interrelated. As you learn about the phonemes in spoken words, that helps you to map the sounds to letters. And as you start to learn phonics, you become better at phonemic awareness. And as you start to develop some automatic word recognition, some oral reading fluency, the more likely you are to understand what you're reading. And the more you understand of what you're reading, the better your fluency becomes. So there's a 2-way relationship all over the place here. But this is just kind of the graphic that I use to generally talk about the fact that reading starts with spoken language and being able to become aware of the phonemes in spoken language, and builds from there up to reading comprehension with vocabulary all along that progression of skills.
Now, where do you put morphological awareness and the teaching of morphology? I like, personally, I consider it more of like an advanced phonics instruction that relates to vocabulary, but I'm curious of your input.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I'm lined up with you, because I tend to represent it in both places. So I think really young kids become aware of morphemes, and maybe that's a word to define in itself, that morphemes are those smallest units of meaning in words. So the word cats has 2 morphemes. It has cat, and then the S changes and makes it a plural. So children become aware of morphemes in spoken language, and it impacts their vocabulary and oral language from a very young age. And it's also, as you have said, very, very useful when students are learning phonics and decoding and those advanced word analysis skills. It helps them to be able to recognize, when they're aware of prefixes and suffixes, for example, helps them to recognize and read multi-syllable words that they're encountering in the intermediate and secondary grades. So I think it might be one layer of language that sort of spans a couple of these components.
Well, especially when we look at, once they go to grade 4 and beyond, when they're looking more at that academic language that has the Greek and Latin roots so prevalently in it, or the Greek and Latin bases. And that can definitely help build their vocabulary and make connections between the words across the curriculum.
That's right. Yeah, it's a real tool to have in the students' toolbox when they're trying to read across the content areas in that way. So did this visual address the question?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so we will cover the sources for the conceptual framework. That's very much based on the National Reading Panel's 2000 report, and it's been built on since then. If you look to the show notes for the replay or the podcast episode, we can have those included below and get you those links.
Yeah, the National Reading Panel report has an executive summary that's a little bit easier to digest. Back then in the year 2000, when that report was released in the US, there was a document called Put Reading First that was an even more digestible summary of the research that resulted in those 5 core components. And then recently, the Reading League devoted an issue of their journal to the updates on the National Reading Panel report. And they hosted through their Facebook page, the Reading League hosted some live events about the updates. So basically the short story is those 5 components are still the essential elements, the building blocks of becoming a reader. Nothing in the 20 years since the National Reading Panel report has refuted those. We've only just learned how important they are, and we've refined the information that we have in many ways, extended on the importance of those skills since then.
Well, and I think it's important to note that it was, I can't remember, Shanahan and someone mid 2000s saw this, that it was the same components essential for EAL, or English as Additional Language learners.
That's right.
So we're not just focusing on English speaking students, we're talking about all students. And there has been research that it's universal across languages.
Right.
These components are essential. So even if it's a syllabic language, there still needs to be that instruction on it. And they need to have the syllable awareness in those languages. They don't necessarily need the phonemic awareness. And then when we're looking at tonal languages, that adds another layer.
Right. So really these are universal, essential components, right? So there are some students who are going to acquire those 5 skills more easily, and there will be other things perhaps that they can focus on in their instruction, but every student has to acquire those skills. So from a teacher's perspective, those are priorities, right? Like those are the things that absolutely must be taught. Every student has to acquire them. And if you're looking at your standards for your grade level, the 5 essential components should really help you to prioritize those. How are you going to spend your time? If you've got a couple of minutes, what are you going to prioritize to do during that time? I think that's how those 5 skills are helpful.
And it's important to note we can work on these skills in a variety of subjects. I know one that I like to draw attention to students is the PH grapheme, representing the F sound, and how in science words and academic words, it's typically a PH because it has that Greek origin. And in the Greek alphabet, there wasn't the letter F. So they use the PH to represent the sound. And just those little tidbits can make a huge difference for kids, especially when they're trying to figure out, oh, is it a PH or an F?
Right. Right. Yeah, that's an important reminder that this doesn't have to happen just during the sort of English language arts block or the reading instruction time of the day, that we can infuse these concepts and the teaching of these skills all throughout all the subject matter that we're teaching.
Mm-hmm. And understanding that there are other experts within the school system that might be able to help you on some of these. And the role of the speech and language pathologist in the school in these early years, especially if you're a teacher that doesn't really understand the whole phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, ask your SLP or your speech and language pathologist to help you, because that's something that they've had extensive training in.
They're
And
the
they
experts.
help you understand.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, because those folks really do know the most about the English language, and from a variety of different angles, and can be very, very helpful in informing reading instruction.
Yeah, and even later on in the report, there's recommendations about screening and the importance of understanding that. And that's something that we haven't mentioned in this conversation yet, but it's important that we give teachers the professional development in screening measures so that they can understand how best to teach their students as a whole class and small group, and what individual attention needs to be given. And that's where your school psychologist can help you understand these measures and how to interpret them, and maybe with the different groupings that you may have within your classroom.
Yeah, so this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I spent 12 years working for an assessment company because when I worked as a school psychologist, I had the experience of wait to fail, right? So that devastating experience of being restricted to only providing intervention support to students if they were behind enough. And it just, it was devastating for what it did for students, a whole cascade of negative events if they didn't get support early on. And so this idea in the report about screening, prevention, and early intervention is so important. So what do we mean by screening? I think it's important to operationalize that, first of all, because screening is a specific type of assessment. And I think if you connect it to something you're familiar with, like medical screening, it can be helpful. So screening assessment in reading needs to, first of all, be brief, because we're hopefully doing what's called universal screening, which means everybody is being screened on a regular interval, like the well baby check when you have a newborn, right? Certain months, you're taking your baby in, and they're doing these indicator. That's a second important aspect of the definition of screening. It has to be brief, and it has to indicate something important. Well, what would be the important skills that we should tap into with reading? Those 5 that we just talked about, right? So if your screening assessment is not measuring those 5 skills, you need to look for another one, right? So you take your baby in for the well baby checks. They're not ill, and they go in on these regular intervals, and you get these indicator assessments. They weigh the baby, they measure the length of the baby. I don't know if they still do this, but they take the little measuring tape around their head, right? So there are these reliable and standardized indicators of overall health and growth for that newborn. That's what we're doing with universal screening of reading. Because everybody's getting it, it's got to be brief. It has to indicate these 5 essential early literacy skills. It has to predict something that's important in the future. So I could get really in the weeds about this. I'll try not to, but what I mean by predict is a good early literacy screener should be able to tell you, based on how the student scored today, what's the prediction for them as a reader in the future. So why do I get so hung up on that? Why do I think that's so important? Because we have like a crystal ball, literally, with some of these indicator skills. Phonemic awareness, letter sound, letter naming. Those skills are a view into the future in preschool and in kindergarten, very, very, very early on, maybe before we've even started to teach reading. How students do on those key skills So phonemic awareness, being able to do things like segment the sounds in a spoken word, letter naming, letter sound connection. So looking at a B and being able to say B. Those skills are predictive of reading comprehension even several years down the road. So this gives us the opportunity to not have to wait until we see who's a reader and who's not a reader. We can predict who's going to be a reader by doing these brief indicator screenings in pre-K, early in kindergarten, throughout kindergarten, early in first grade. Not just so we can say, oh, sorry, doesn't look like you're on track to be a reader, but so we can actually act on that information. It's not a compliance activity. It's not check the box, oh, we've done our screening. I hope that these recommendations in this report will not become just a check the box. Somebody told me I have to do literacy screening, check, moving on. But to really take that information, find those students who are struggling in these critical early literacy skills and teach them differently, teach them in a way so that they master these skills, and actually you change the prediction, you change the outcome for that student when you equip them with these early literacy skills. It's very doable. It doesn't have to be a mystery. It's not necessarily easy for especially some students with dyslexia, for example, but it is doable. And the earlier we identify concerns, the earlier we act on that knowledge that a student might be struggling, the more likely the student is to become a skilled reader in the future. To me, that's super encouraging and empowering for teachers. So I hope they'll see it that way when they see these recommendations about screening.
Well, and I've spoken to so many teachers that even in their first year of screening, and it's not just putting the results in a spreadsheet and forgetting about them.
That's right.
Taking those results, using them to inform your instruction about your small group intervention and even your class-wide instruction, so that you can take those kids to the next level, because the most effective intervention period is that K-2.
That's right.
And if we're waiting until grade 3 to identify, we've missed out, and we can spend, 10 times as long intervening and not getting the same results. And it's not fair to the student, it's not fair to the family, and it's not fair to society because of the long-term cost, both social, emotional, and financial. I remember, I think last week I saw some meme about it's cheaper to teach kids how to read than it is to intervene or something like that.
Yeah. Just teach it from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
But the screening has to be focused on those essential skills, right? We don't need to screen a whole laundry list of things. We don't need to screen things that are irrelevant or not as predictive of reading comprehension. The research is really clear. It's converged around those 5 skill areas. And that's what we should be indicating when we're doing early literacy screening. It's really the foundation of the MTSS model that's mentioned in this report as a recommendation for in-service training. You can't implement a system, a multi-tiered system of supports for students without good screening data. It's the number one first step. So as schools are thinking about moving forward with in-service training, with implementing the recommendations in this report, my recommendation would be to start with screening. Get yourself a good, reliable, and valid screening assessment. And why that's important is because you have to know what your students need. So what you're going to see all throughout the recommendations for in-service professional development is differentiation and matching instruction to student needs. You can't do that if you don't know what the students need. So finding out the needs of your students, the magnitude of those needs, the proportion of students who are at risk for future reading problems helps you know, do we need to be planning for all of our first graders or just this handful, this small group of first graders who are struggling? What's the magnitude of the need within our school? That's where the MTSS model really starts.
Definitely. And, at least in the Canadian curriculums, we don't have a standard scope and sequence for the grades for phonics instruction.
Mm.
And when you go into the classroom at the beginning of the year, you don't know what your students have. I was speaking to a two teacher, and she said, she was ready to, start where she thought the kids would be. And then she did her screening and realized that she had to go back to, the first step to make sure that all of her students had the basic grapheme, phoneme, or letter sound correspondences so that they could succeed. And I think you have to be in a position where you're willing to do that and realize that even though you're in grade 2, you need to go back to the grade 1 concepts that your students don't have, or the kindergarten concepts, wherever you are at a program, especially in the higher grades. And that's where, you can screen in higher grades. I think it's pretty standard to say, 2 to 3 times a year from K to 2 or K to 3, in grade 3, just doing the ones that have not been performing well, but the ones that are okay, you don't need to worry about it. But when you're looking at the older students and looking at the intervention side, those screeners are really important, especially when you're looking at dyslexic students. And dyslexia is very much a phonological processing issue. And as a dyslexic who has a phonological processing issue, I can tell you I still struggle with it.
Yeah.
And so you need to know where your student is at and understand where you need to put the instruction at, and realize that you may have some high school students that you need to do that basic sound manipulation because they can't do it. They can't hear it. And until they can, working on some of the higher phonological awareness skills and decoding skills, you're not doing anything for anyone except for causing frustration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really valuable reminder or message to give teachers and also administrators, I think, so that the administrators give the teachers permission to go back to where the students' skills are, to meet students where they are, to not just keep hammering away at grade level reading comprehension, but to go back to where they know their students actually are with their skills currently, meet them there, and provide intervention to accelerate them to catch up. But too often, in grade 3 and above, administrators and teachers are focused on the grade level reading comprehension. And again, going back to my comments about the simple view, rather than just continuing to hammer away at grade level reading comprehension, we have to see this progression of skills that gets you to be able to access the meaning of that grade level text. And screening can tell you where is each student on that path towards reading comprehension. And you got to go back and meet them where they are and fill in those gaps. There's not a workaround. There's no bypass that you can take on that path to reading comprehension. Everybody has to acquire the same skills. So, hopefully administrators will recognize that more and more as they learn about the science of reading, and give teachers permission to do that differentiation, understanding that it's not competing with the goal of reading comprehension. It's actually the mechanism to get them to reading comprehension.
Definitely. And there is no one size fits all approach.
Definitely not. That's where ongoing assessment is so necessary. You find out where students are from screening, maybe even from going deeper with diagnostic assessment. You give that evidence-based instruction and intervention. But even with that good match, even with starting with something that's got an evidence base, there's no guarantee it's going to work for that individual student. You have to have ongoing progress monitoring, also recommended in the report, so that you get the feedback as the teacher. Is this well-planned intervention actually working for this individual child? And if it's not, you need to be ready to make a change. You need to be able to have another way of approaching teaching that skill for that student. So it's that ongoing progress monitoring cycle is such an important part of assessment.
Yeah. And it allows you to realize that you have to be flexible, as you were saying.
Yep.
In your intervention techniques. And even if it's something that's outside of your comfort zone, you need to recognize that you're doing yourself and the student a disservice if you're going to make them complete the program when it's not appropriate for their needs.
Yeah. Well, that's where deep knowledge is required, right? The teachers, and especially special educators who are working with students with disabilities, have to have a deep bag of tricks, right? And have to be responsive to the needs of their students and be able to pivot and make a change if the first thing that they try isn't working. Also have that that relentless pursuit of the outcomes for the student is the way that I think about it. You know, really highly skilled interventionists just don't give up. It's like, find a way or make a way. You know, they're going to get outcomes for their students one way or another.
Yeah. If you can't learn the way I teach, I'll teach the way you learn.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah. It's important because it definitely has long-term effects on these students.
Absolutely.
And one thing that I think is important to highlight to administrators, I know there's the shuffle between grades for teachers, but that's very difficult when you're just on this discovery process, and having to jump from grade to grade. You know, even if it's a grade apart, it's a little bit easier. But if you're just figuring out it in one grade and then jumping to a grade that's, you know, 2 grades above or behind, you're having to reinvent the wheel. And, you know, some people may enjoy doing that, but, you know, doing it 1 year and then, oh, you know what, next year I want to do this little tweak here and little tweak there. It takes a couple of years to really get it. And, you know, research showing it takes about 5 years to go from a balanced literacy curriculum to one that's aligned with the science of reading or structured literacy. And I argue that it's best to try and keep the teachers in the same grade range.
Yeah, that's a really good practical tip. Yeah, I hope administrators will keep that in mind and keep teachers in the grade as much as they possibly can. Yeah, for that deep learning. You know, you sort of learn those instructional methods the first year, and it's very clunky and you don't feel good about what you're doing. And the second year you feel like you can sort of get into a groove and you sort of actually are doing it correctly and you're getting some results with your students. And the third year you can start to riff off of that, right? Like you can start to improve upon it and really perfect the craft of teaching in an explicit and systematic way.
Yeah. Can you quickly cover the importance of the explicit, systematic nature of instruction?
Yeah.
That's definitely another key takeaway from this report.
Yeah, so those are terms that you'll see in the reading research for quite a long time. People are using the term structured literacy to refer to the what to teach, but also the how to teach in this explicit, systematic, and dynamic way. So explicit for me means teaching directly with errorless learning. So without the possibility of making a mistake. So it's highly scaffolded. Students, when they receive explicit instruction, are being supported to give the correct answer, is the way that I think about it. So rather than asking the student to discover the answer, rather than asking students to explore and perhaps discuss and deduce their own answer to things, when students are new, when it's a high stakes skill like reading, when there's one right answer, all of those things are true about beginning readers, especially. We should just give it to them directly, right? We don't need them to discover it. So being explicit means telling the student what you are going to teach them, teaching it to them directly. So modeling it, showing them, telling them the right answer, and then supporting them through a series of scaffolded experiences, supporting them to produce the correct answer, making them have opportunities to repeatedly produce the correct answer when they are with you, in front of you, so that you can be there to give that immediate affirmative and corrective feedback. Errorless learning is what we're going for here, right? So supporting them to perform the skill, to say the answer, to do it correctly, and then giving those overtime experiences to practice what you have seen them do correctly in front of you. Practice it in a variety of different contexts. Practice that letter sound combination in reading and spelling, and practice it over and over and over again until it becomes something they can do effortlessly and automatically, not just accurately. So that's, for me, what's sort of wrapped up in this idea of explicit instruction. And it is exactly the opposite of what many teachers were told to do in their teacher training programs, right? So this is where in service training, there's going to be some, pushback and some conflict. Teachers have been told many times that reading instruction is an art, that the job is to be a guide, to not intervene, to watch the natural process of reading develop and just create the environment for that natural process to happen. That has gotten us into a very bad situation in Canada and the US, where too few students are becoming skilled readers. So it's exactly the wrong thing. This idea of being a guide that's just watching with minimal interference, a natural process unfolding. No, that is not the way reading happens. It's not the way reading should be taught. So now I'm going off on a on a soapbox from your question.
Well, no, of course. And the thing to highlight is that research has repeatedly shown that this can be done, and that we can get 95% of our students reading.
Yeah.
With this approach to instruction.
Yeah.
And I think that alone should be enough.
Yeah, it
Looking
works.
at where we are now to where we could be. And, in the questions it was bringing up, Dr. Linda Siegel's study in North Vancouver, Reading 44, and, how she did this. And this has been done several times in several places with several different students and language backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses. Like it's at the point where we know it works, and we need to make sure that we're doing it. Yeah. And again, I can get on the same soapbox if there's enough room.
Join me. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about doing the best we can for our students. And, I love seeing that little light bulb go off in the head when they get so excited, especially in those younger years, but even in a student that's older, even working with adults, and they're like, why didn't you tell me this the first time around? Like, I get it now.
Yeah.
It makes sense. And that's a very rewarding experience.
And that's what we want every educator to have as an experience, right? So looking at the recommendations in this report might seem daunting. Like this might be not just new learning for many educators, but it might seem like a burden. It's going to take some time. Here I am saying, how some of these things are complicated and it needs to be sustained over time. But the bottom line is, when you learn to teach in this way, the way that's supported by research, you will be more effective with your students. And that's what every teacher wants. You went into education to change lives. And so this is going to be the way that you are actually able to do that. You're going to feel more effective. It may take some investment in your own learning to make this shift. It may be awkward for you. It may challenge your beliefs. It may be in conflict with what your, perhaps treasured professors at university told you. So it may not always be a smooth path, but at the end of it, and even when you first start, I've found that when you start teaching in the way that's lined up with the reading research, you will get results for your students. I hear it over and over and over again from teachers, how excited they are that once they started to implement explicit reading instruction, they saw results for their students. They got outcomes for their students. Somebody sent me a report for their kindergarten class this morning, actually, and all but 3 students were at the end of grade level expectations in a group of very challenged students who did not come in with those skills. I can tell you that. So my point is, this is worth the investment of time. It's worth the learning because you're going to see the payoff for your students. That's the bottom line. It's the point of going on this science of reading journey.
And you're not alone in doing it. And there are people to help support you.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're a literacy consultant. I'm a literacy consultant. Schools can get external experts, which again is one of the recommendations in this,
Right.
to help them through this process and help the teachers, scaffold the teacher's instruction and the changes across the curriculum so that they can have success. Because as I love Dr. Anita Archer's quote, success breeds success.
Yeah.
And it really does.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Stoller. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for hosting the conversation.